Something I found very striking in your latest book was the West has been wrestling with this question of being for a long time.
Yeah.
And Heraclitus this goes back all the way to Aristotle commenting on Heraclitus, who said that everything is in the state of flux. Everything is constantly changing. And Aristotle, of course, says there's a being that underlies reality. And I wanted to give a quote from your book and
Sure.
ask you to commentate on this. You said, you talked about evolution, and you say, if evolution is true, then is there really any underlying being that undergoes accidental change but is not itself changed? If all things are constantly developing, then being is becoming. Everything is in the state of flux. And then you ask the question, could the concept of substance be in such an evolution, have any meaning in such an evolutionary model? What I wanted to ask you, a fairly broad question again, is, do you think that the Catholics, especially in this modern day, what we see in your average Novus Ordo community, do you think they've succeeded in reconciling evolution with an Aristotelian framework that doesn't compromise the Catholic and traditional Thomistic philosophical and theological approach?
Oh boy, that's a big question. I don't know that most, run-of-the-mill Catholics in your average Novus Ordo parish have an Aristotelian framework to even
Fair,
contradict.
yeah, fair enough.
So have they reconciled it? No, but probably because they don't have an Aristotelian framework to begin with. I think this issue of substance is the real issue here. I personally don't think the real issue is whether God could orchestrate reality, that one thing changes into another thing over time. I think the real issue is their underlying being, because the Catholic Church absolutely has adopted and embraced the notions of substance, right? That there is an underlying, there's human nature. I mean, that's what nature is as a substance, right? When we're talking about human nature, we're talking about the substance of being a human person. Without the concept of substance, there is no Catholic theology. There is no Catholic morality. And so I think this is the fundamental issue here. And I'm kind of surprised that when I was reading the source material on the debates about evolution in the post-Darwinian era, this didn't come up really. There was a lot of wrangling about very particular things like, okay, well, maybe Adam's body could have been created by pre-existing matter, but what about Eve? Because she came from Adam's rib. So how do you read that? Like very, very particular questions about the biblical narrative. But I was surprised that in the records of the debates of the Congregation of the Index on various evolutionary books, that I didn't come across debates about substance. Maybe they were in there and that the secondary sources I was reading just didn't quote them. But at any rate, I think that most Catholics have embraced evolution, but I don't think they've embraced it in an integrated way. That is, if you were to ask them, how do you reconcile that with, say, original sin having to come from two original parents, right? I don't think they would have a ready answer for how to reconcile that. I think that probably practically speaking, most, and I'm just saying Novus Ordo, kind of normie Catholics, I think they're operating under a practical version of C.J.R. Brabant's two-truth theory, where they've accepted a scientific truth and then there's a religious truth, and they simultaneously hold both without attempting to reconcile them. So that's where I think most people are at. Now, that's a different question from saying, do I believe it can be reconciled? I think it probably could. And I talk about it in the book a little bit. And I don't put my own ideas into this book. When I say that it could, I'm giving other authors and other authorities' opinions on how it could be reconciled. You could have, for example, some have proposed, you could have substances that God created, but there's a certain elasticity within that substance where it's not possible for anything to transform into anything, but it is possible, for, say, something that has four legs to develop into another version of that thing with four legs, a deer into a giraffe or whatever, a more moderated form of of evolution. But one thing I stress in the book, and this is important, is that Darwinism is not the same as evolution. One thing I did notice in the 19th century is that Catholic theologians made a distinction between transformism and Darwinism. And transformism was just the basic concept that things could change over time, regardless of the mechanism of how they changed. Darwinism in specific was the idea of evolution by means of a mechanistic natural selection. And this was universally condemned. I did not find any Catholic authorities that embrace Darwinism hook, line, and sinker. Basically, the approach of the church in the late 19th century, early 20th centuries, you found people all over the map on it. You found people that rejected the thing whole scale and were skeptical of it. And you found a lot of people who supported transformism, but they were troubled by the materialist philosophy of Darwin. And what they tried to do was find some sort of harmonization or reconciliation where they could keep transformism, but kind of shorn of its materialist philosophy. And most of the critiques of Darwinism were about its materialist presuppositions. And so they were struggling to find a way to shave that off of it. And you found some people saying, yes, we can do this, and other people saying, no, Darwinism and materialism are so wedded together that you can't have transformism without a materialist framework for it. And I'm just going to go into this, like the way the church approached this. There was 6 cases of books being brought to the Congregation of the Index between, I think, 1878 and 1900 that had to do with evolution. And what I found from studying this is that both, so you find, this is why history is so interesting. It'll upturn what you thought. I'd been used to a certain dichotomy in the debate, this dichotomy of trads saying the church has always condemned evolution. And then kind of like more modern normies saying the church has never had a problem with evolution. And I found out that both of those positions were wrong. They were wrong in the sense of this. The church has definitely had problems with evolution. It's impossible to read the debates that were going on in the Congregation of the Index about some of this literature and come to the conclusion that theologians were just happy with evolution. They absolutely had grave reservations about it for all the reasons you can imagine they would have reservations about it. But it's also false to say that the church has condemned evolution. No book proposing evolution was ever condemned by the Holy Office. You had 3 books that were condemned by the Congregation of the Index, which is different, and it's not authoritative. And of those 3 books that were condemned, it's questionable whether they were condemned because of evolution, because the Index, the Congregation of the Index did not divulge publicly why they condemn books. So, for example, you got a book by the English Catholic writer St. George Mivart. St. George is his first name. He's not a saint. He died excommunicate, but his name is St. George, okay? You have a book where he argues for evolution, and you also have writings of him where he's arguing that people can be happy in hell. And he gets condemned because of his teaching that people can be happy in hell, but he also argues for evolution. But these things aren't spelled out in the condemnations of the Index. You don't have any cases where a book was condemned specifically and explicitly for evolution. You do see the Congregation of the Index going outside official channels with certain books. For example, Father Dalmas Leroy, a French Dominican who wrote a book favorable to evolution. You find the congregation going to him through back channels and saying, we don't like your book and we'd prefer that you withdrew it from circulation. And if you don't, it might get condemned. And Father Leroy saying, I don't want to risk that, so he withdraws his book. But that's not the same as a formal condemnation. So what you find is that essentially is that the church discouraged the spread of evolution, but evolutionary thought, but through unofficial means. And by unofficial means, I mean things like peer pressure, using behind-the-scenes wrangling, implied threats, quid pro quo arrangements with specific authors. Basically, the church understood that evolution often went hand in hand with atheism and materialism, and they understood that logically transformism was distinct from atheism, but it was so often being used as a club in the hands of the church's enemies that they were just wary of allowing it to spread unchecked. And so they did everything they could to check the spread of evolutionary thought, but specifically without condemning it outright. And I think because they were afraid of coming out on the wrong side if the science should prove them wrong. And the Galileo case was absolutely in everybody's mind here. The one time that any pope ever intervened in one of these cases was when Pope Leo XIII intervened to stop, and I stress to stop, Father John Zahm's book on evolution from getting condemned. Father John Zahm was an American priest who wrote a book called Evolution and Dogma. It was about to get condemned by the Index, and Pope Leo XIII intervened to stop its public condemnation, and to allow Father Zahm to kind of handle the situation privately. And what Father Zahm did was he privately went to the publishers and had the book withdrawn from circulation. So this is why I say it's not true to say the church condemned evolution, and it's also not true to say the church accepted it. I will say the accurate view is that the church didn't like it and did everything it could to stop it from spreading, short of publicly condemning it.
Yeah. And I think that's really interesting, especially because nowadays we think of it almost as an issue that's only been going on for the past 60, 70 years. But as you said, it's been going on for quite a long time.